1 month after
a lot of people did.
I said, this man is going to be the Republican nominee.
Right.
I said I'm Bill Maher. Everybody laughed. They
you're
thought
one of us, and we're a
They thought I was joking, and I said, well, that's because, fellow lefty liberals, you don't watch Celebrity Apprentice.
That was Michael Moore talking to us just after the election about the rise of Donald Trump. The New Yorker is out with a new piece profiling producer Mark Burnett and his part in the ascension of Donald Trump through the creation of the Apprentice TV show. Former Apprentice editor Jonathan Braun told the magazine, quote, "Most of us knew Trump was a fake. He had just gone through I don't know how many bankruptcies, but we made him out to be the most important person in the world. It was like making the court jester the king." With us now, the reporter behind the New Yorker piece, Patrick Radden Keefe. And Patrick, there's a line in the piece that I was fascinated by as Burnett and the producers walked through Trump Towers and were walking through his offices as they were preparing to try to turn this man into king. They saw chipped chairs. They saw other signs actually of a business that was holding on for dear life. Far from being some business titan, this looked like a man who we walked through I'll just read it. We walked through the offices and saw chipped furniture. We saw a crumbling empire at every turn. Our job was to make it seem otherwise. Talk about that.
Well, this was, for me, the crazy thing about The Apprentice. I lived in New York in the 1990s, and I remember Donald Trump being kind of a punchline. You know, you'd read about him on page 6. The weirdness of the show is that at the point where Mark Burnett, the producer of The Apprentice, found Trump, Trump was kind of at a low point. But they remold him as this titan, and the idea is this is one of the most successful people in the world. It would be a privilege for anyone to come and be tutored by him as his apprentice. And so you end up in this kind of strange situation in which they take a guy who's, as the guy said, you know, we take the court jester and we remake him as the king.
Well, they thought it was very campy and almost done like so many things that we thought Trump did, almost with a nod and a wink. But they were shocked that so many Americans bought into Trump as the epitome of success. What was the great Fran Lebowitz quote? Donald Trump is a poor person's view of a rich person.
Yeah. Yeah, but this is the strange thing. I talked to a bunch of people who were involved in The Apprentice over the years, and a lot of them sounded this note, which is basically like, oh, we delivered the whole thing with a wink. We knew, because we worked with Donald every day, that it wasn't true, that he wasn't really this master of the universe. But it was all done in this kind of campy sort of arch way. I went back and I watched several dozen episodes of the show, and it doesn't come across that way now. So there's a little bit of dissonance there where people who are involved in it say, oh my God, America took it seriously. We were joking all along. You know, it was never really meant to be entirely sincere. But I go back and it seems to me that the show is sincerely presenting Donald Trump as something that we know he wasn't.
Now, there's no question that the show refurbished and burnished his image, the idea that he was presented as this businessman, and that became the central part of his campaign, at least to start. It was obviously it changed. We had a lot of ideas about immigration and other things go on, but the central premise of the Trump campaign was this is a successful businessman who could run the company as a CEO. And in your reporting, have you seen, even then, during this genesis of the show, was there a suggestion that this could be something he would use as a platform, or was this something that he simply needed to get back on his feet as a businessman?
I don't think that anybody knew, anybody had any inkling that he would seriously pursue the presidency. I talked to people who were involved with the show who said that even when he announced, this isn't in the piece, but something I learned was that when he announced his campaign, he said that he was going to run. Everybody privately who was involved in The Apprentice kind of rolled their eyes and figured this is going to take a little while. It'll play itself out. Let's start casting the next season because we know Donald's going to be back. And so there was a great deal of surprise among people who did the show that he actually went ahead and ran and became president.
Bob Costas with us and has a question. Bob?
The Apprentice and Mark Burnett get a lot of blame in certain circles for the rise of President Trump. But this was someone who was also thinking about running for president going back to 1988 to his trip to New Hampshire, who wrote a best-selling biography in the late 80s. How much does that tabloid culture, the business culture of 1980s New York, and the way people played to him then matter for his political career, maybe more or as much as The Apprentice?
Well, yeah, look, there's no question he had been a celebrity going back to the 1980s. I think it's the kind of celebrity that he was. So I talked to Tony Schwartz, who wrote The Art of the Deal, and he said, look, we obviously had a great impact in putting Trump on the map nationally, but Tony Schwartz said, I was nothing compared to Mark Burnett. The Apprentice was what really put him into American households, and not as the guy who did the cameo in the movie in the not as the guy from Home Alone, but as this person who was this kind of peerless executive with great judgment who people came to and consulted on important matters.
Yeah, Kristen, what do you think about that? It seems everybody is assigned blame for Donald Trump. I know that people in my family talked about my brother reading The Art of the Deal back in the 1980s and becoming an admirer of Donald Trump's then. It seems there's a long list there. Do you think it's the TV show like Reagan in the 1950s? Do you think it was Donald Trump's TV show starting in the early 2000s that led him to the presidency?
I think it certainly played a big role. I mean, it allowed him to build upon a brand that has already been mentioned. It was something that he was building, for decades. I remember hearing about Donald Trump when I'd go visit my grandparents in Palm Beach in the late 80s. You'd hear about Donald Trump. As a kid, I was hearing about this guy. And look, his name is on buildings. He has always, outside of just The Apprentice, he's made a big strategy of, look, I'm going to have my name on every building. It's not just going to be a real estate empire. It's going to be an empire about me as an individual. And so I guess my question about this piece is, when you were interviewing folks about this and they were talking about, having to re-burnish Trump's image, was there a sense that you also needed to, Donald Trump, I think on The Apprentice is portrayed in some ways as not just, smart, but he's not portrayed as a bad individual. He's portrayed as someone who's tough, but he's not necessarily portrayed as someone with a bunch of deep character flaws. Nowadays, we have so many TV shows where you have the anti-hero, where you have their flaws put on display, and it's actually part of what makes them compelling. Do you sense that there was any sort of room for having when you were interviewing for this piece, was there a sense that, folks didn't want to have any of his flaws on display, or how did that factor in?
Well, I think, Trump is Trump, and I think that Mark Burnett saw that, and he's a magnetic personality, there's no question. And so part of what the show did play up is that he was a straight shooter. He called it like he saw it. If he's loyal to you, he's going to take care of you, but if he doesn't like you or if you cross him, he's going to take revenge forever. And so all of that kind of played into the drama of the show. I think what was striking to me was in talking to people about the editing process. For every hour that you saw of The Apprentice on TV, they shot an average of 300 hours of footage with all these different cameras following different crews. And then it's this point where the editors sit down and they put together a story. So for me, this was the fascinating aspect of this, is there's a kind of retroactive narrative construction, right, where Trump makes a decision, an impulsive decision. A lot of the time he hadn't prepared, he didn't know what was going on, but he would just kind of shoot from the hip, make a gut decision. And then the editors have to come in afterwards and think, oh geez, how can we reconstruct what happened over the prior week to make his gut decision make sense? And this was striking to me because on some level, this is about, Americans looking at reality television and mistaking it for reality. It's a kind of alternative facts that we get, and it similarly sort of echoes what you now see in the White House.
We've all seen the Access Hollywood tape. There's been a lot of speculation about the outtakes from this show that potentially could contain damaging information for Donald Trump. Can you give us an update? Where are these tapes? Do you think they'll ever see the light of day?
So there are, as I mentioned, because so much footage was shot, there are tens of thousands of hours of footage that are held by MGM, which now owns Mark Burnett's company. And they are not going to release those tapes. They have legal reasons why they cannot do so. I talked to a whole bunch of people about what might be on those tapes. Where I came out is that there's a great deal of Trump saying awful things about women, which he did on the show. Is there anything that rises to the level of the Access Hollywood tape? I don't know. There's been a lot of speculation about Trump using the N-word on one of these tapes, and I came out, I don't know what I don't know, but having talked to a whole bunch of people about this, I came out believing that tape probably doesn't exist. I talked to people who would know, editors who worked on the show for years, people who hate Trump, and they basically said, look, if anybody knew about that tape, I would know about it. I would love to know about that tape. I would leak that tape if I had it. It doesn't exist. What they told me is if there was such a tape, it would have spread by now, it would have come out.
Yeah, and you know, those people who spent time with him, and I certainly, Mika and I spent time with him over a decade, off and on, behind closed doors. Yes, there were times he would say misogynistic things, but one of the things that surprised us about the political persona that he took on is he did not say racially insensitive things, at least around us behind closed doors. In fact, if you just look at the women that he dated and continued to date, it certainly goes against that. The people that he hung out with, the friends that he had, the acquaintances that he had in Atlantic City, it certainly would suggest that that was not a part of Donald Trump's personality until he decided to, in a grotesque way, make it part of his political persona. The New Yorker's Patrick Radden Keefe, thank you so much for being with us. Bob Costa and Kristen Soltis Anderson, thank you all both as well. And still ahead, he was described as undeniably pushy. He cut corners and deliberately employed extravagances and exaggeration for polling effect. We're talking about Winston Churchill. And we'll talk to historian and author Andrew Roberts about his new biography, as some say is the greatest Churchill single-volume biography yet. We'll have more with Tom Nichols as well when we return. Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.